Welcome to Measuring Success Right, the official podcast of the Marriott Student Review, a podcast for students by students, where we connect the leaders of tomorrow with the issues of today.
I would really encourage anybody who's passionate about what they're doing, and I think you have to have the passion to do it. But if you're passionate about it, jump in.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Measuring Success Right. My name is Spencer McWilliams, co-host of the show and the host of today's episode. I had the wonderful opportunity to interview Carrie Moore, who is an adjunct professor in the journalism major. She's also the newsroom manager for the Daily Universe on campus. Before coming to BYU, she worked for the Deseret News covering religion and ethics. Carrie serves as the executive director of a nonprofit organization that she started called the Bradley Center for Grieving Children and Families. This nonprofit focuses on families who have experienced a sudden loss in their family. We talk about Carrie's experiences and how she started this nonprofit, the story behind it, and what it means to her. She also gives really good advice to those who may be thinking of starting their own nonprofit organization. We also dive into Carrie's career in journalism and her experience in the interfaith community. This was a really fun episode to do, and it was really lovely talking to Carrie and getting to know all of the experiences that she's had in her life and how it's led up to what she's doing today. So without further ado, I hope you all enjoy this episode. Well, welcome, Carrie. We're so happy to have you here today.
Thank you.
So to start off, we just want the audience to get to know you a little bit better. We know that you are an adjunct faculty professor at in the journalism program, and you're the newsroom manager for the Universe. But do you want to give us a little history on your background in the communications field and how you got to where you are now?
Sure. I was at BYU many years ago and graduated with a degree in communications. I worked in the newsroom in several different positions when I was here as a student, including editor-in-chief. And shortly after that, took a job in Arizona and then jumped to the Deseret News for about 25 years. So I have had a long and very satisfying career in journalism before I actually came back to BYU to teach. But I have to say, being here is the best part of my career in journalism.
Well, I personally had you as a boss at the Daily Universe, and I thought you were an incredible leader in the newsroom. And I've learned so much about journalism, even though I hadn't pursued that major. I learned a lot of aspects about writing and news reporting that I don't think I could have gotten anywhere else. So you're doing great.
Well, thank
at
you.
Your job.
We were really happy to have you and sorry to see you leave, but it's fun to see you pursuing what you're doing now.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Okay. So you spent 25 years for the Deseret News.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
So what sections did you cover, and I guess how did you get to what you were reporting and covering?
Most of what I did was cover faith, religion, the LDS Church, but also other aspects of the faith community in Utah. And I had a real passion for the whole concept of interfaith cooperation. So I had the opportunity to work with a lot of fabulous religious leaders here in the state, not only Latter-day Saints, but a wide variety of leaders, Jewish rabbis and Catholic imams and a lot of Christian denominations, and really enjoyed the chance to get to know them in a personal way. There is so much dynamic religious faith in our state. And a lot of people don't realize or recognize what a broad spectrum of faith we have here in Utah.
What was that like, getting to know those other faith spectrums? Because Utah is like predominantly of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints faith. And I feel like the other faiths, like you said, they always get overlooked, or we just don't see a lot of them around us. But what was that like for you to work or get to know them through like your work and your career?
It was a really great opportunity for me. When I was at BYU, I spent a semester abroad in Jerusalem. So I was very familiar with, the conflict that goes on between religious groups there. And when I came back to Utah and decided to pursue journalism, one of the things that I really had as a goal was to try to write about faith in a way that was inclusive and recognize the contributions that so many people make, and the role that conflict tends to play, not only, in the Middle East, obviously, but for decades, Utah was a very religiously conflicted place. Back in 2002, when the Winter Olympics came to Salt Lake City, I was privileged to cover and kind of watch this whole interfaith concept develop in Salt Lake City through an organization called the Salt Lake Interfaith Roundtable. And those leaders came together to say, we're going to welcome the world here. We want everyone who comes to feel comfortable. We don't want anybody to feel excluded. And that particular group started a larger interfaith movement in Utah that still is bearing fruit to this day from my perspective. And I had the chance to talk to a lot of people across the religious spectrum, particularly after that group had formed, and have been very happy with what I've seen in the years since then in terms of interfaith cooperation and dialogue in the state of Utah, a lot of which was not there before.
Yeah. And in learning about that and in reporting on that, what kind of skills did you gain, like in the communications field, to be able to, communicate the interfaith culture in Utah?
Well, I think one of the most important parts about that was to recognize that division had been created over the decades through a lot of interesting events that created a series of misunderstandings about how we ought to be treating each other. Part of that stemmed, frankly, from the idea that a lot of people who moved to the state of Utah who did not grow up here found that their families were in some way socially ostracized, because when parents would find out that the family down the street wasn't, Latter-day Saint, all of a sudden it was, well, you guys can't play with those kids. I mean, you can say hello to them, but you can't really get involved with them. Yeah. And I was very, very heartened after a ton of respect over many years for President Gordon B. Hinckley when he had actually addressed that issue head on in General Conference many years back, and basically said, if that's the way you're acting, that's not Christ-like. Yeah. That has a cultural aberration. It's not part of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I have seen since movement toward this idea that we're all children of God. Yeah. We may have a different looking or sounding God based on who we are, but that has been very satisfying to me personally, as I spent many years watching that develop and writing about it. So we're not perfect. We never probably will be, but I believe the climate here for interfaith relationships is much better than it's ever been.
Oh, yeah. And I know that what I read in your bio, that you are a chaplain. Yes. And that you did it in the pastoral patient care in the health field. Yes. Did that kind of help you in your process or in your journey in becoming a chaplain, or why you wanted to become a chaplain?
Absolutely. As I saw how important those relationships were, I got later into my career, rather than simply documenting what other people were doing and trying to create those kinds of relationships and bridge those gaps, I decided I really wanted to do that hands-on professionally. Yeah. So when I left the Deseret News, I had gone through a year-long training program before I left the paper to become an interfaith chaplain, and was able to move into pastoral patient care right after leaving, and ended up starting my nonprofit as well, based on the fact that I was a chaplain and I wanted to bring that into what we were doing with grief support. So it was kind of a natural evolution. As I trained as a chaplain, took those skills into a hospital and eventually a hospice, but also into a nonprofit where we have people from lots of different faith backgrounds coming to us who have lost a loved one. And God is always a part of that process in some fashion or form for almost everyone, especially in this state. But clinically, it's long been taboo in many quarters to talk about God and grief in the same sentence. If you're in a clinical setting, most clinicians don't want to go to that space simply because, first of all, they haven't been trained in it, but secondly, it's a little more ethereal than a lot of people are comfortable with. So I wanted to bring that into the grief support realm in a way that I hadn't seen it done in Utah.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I don't even know what a chaplain does typically, but from what you've explained to me, it sounds like it's really helped you a lot in what your nonprofit that you mentioned, but also in understanding and recognizing the interfaith situation that we mentioned earlier in that you mentioned earlier in the podcast. Mm-hmm. So, speaking of your nonprofit, it's called the Bradley Center. Is it the Bradley Center or the Bradley Center for Grief?
It's called the Bradley Center for Grieving Children and Families.
Okay. Do you want to give us a little bit of your story about it and how it got started and what you guys do?
Sure. Like I said, I decided to train as a chaplain after having spent many years writing as a journalist about faith issues and interfaith issues. And I wanted to do that as a result of that experience, but also because my family had been through a personal tragedy, and I had seen the impact that the loss, especially a sudden tragic loss of a parent, has on kids. My husband was killed in a corporate plane crash in 1996. He was the former chief financial officer for Swire Coca-Cola in Salt Lake City. And their corporate plane went down in January of that year, killing everybody on board. And they left behind 17 children.
Wow.
So I had a chance to meet with the other widows for probably a year after the accident. And it was a really great support system because we had all been through the same, tragedy, and our children were going through similar kinds of things.
Yeah.
So at that time, I was working at the Deseret News, but I decided because I was having a really hard time finding resources for my children, that once my children were grown and I've got them through that experience and what they would have to go through during their teen years, that I would create a place for families who needed that kind of grief support and were dealing with those big existential questions about why did God let this happen? How do I hang on to my faith now? All of those things that I saw one of my children in particular go through. So,
yeah, that's incredible. And in starting the nonprofit, was it just you by yourself, or did you do it with the other widows that were also grieving at the time?
I approached the wife of the CEO. Her name's Janice Taylor. Mm-hmm. And we had been good friends, but had, been single mothers for many years and kind of drifted apart a bit because you get busy in your own life trying to provide and cover all the bases as a single mom. But I caught up with her and we had lunch one day and I just said, Janice, I've got something I want to bounce off you and see, if this is something that you'd be interested in doing. And she just jumped on board immediately.
Oh, yeah, that's great.
Her kids had struggled as well. And, we've had children who have had to deal with addiction in large measure as a result of trying to cope with their pain in an unhealthy way. And so we got together and we were able to get some funding in place. And on the 15th anniversary of the plane crash, we started the Bradley Center.
And what kind of things do you guys do? You say that you mentioned you help, especially for children that are grieving with the loss of a parent or a sudden loss of a loved one. What kind of things have you guys done and that you are currently doing to help these children and help these families?
We actually hold grief support groups for children and their parents or guardians. So on Monday nights, currently we have about 25 families enrolled in our program. Since the Bradley Center was founded in 2011, we've had helped more than 1,000 people, which has been really fulfilling. But as we see them walk in the door, we know exactly what they're feeling because we can see it all over their faces, and we recognize that that's a really vulnerable place to be, especially for people who say, I know my kids are struggling, I don't know what to do, but I'm not sure who can help me. And so to put yourself in that vulnerable space and say, I will try this because I'm desperate and I need them to get some help, it's just been really fabulous to see families come in wondering if there's any hope for the future. And by the time they leave, I mean, they're on a really good trajectory and their kids are healthy. And, you know, a lot of them are looking forward to going to college and moving on with their lives in a really healthy way.
So when you worked as a chaplain in the health field, did you help with specifically that kind of area, where like with children, or what did you work in with as a chaplain?
Only periodically with kids at that point, because I was working at a hospital in Salt Lake City. And often those chaplains in hospitals are often dealing with fairly dramatic situations, tragic accidents, and, you know, people coming to the emergency room. Nobody wants to be in a hospital emergency room, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of my time working in the hospital and then in the hospice field was spent with adults who were either looking at the possibility of knowing they were dying or working with their family members to try to help them through the process of accepting the fact that their loved one was going to die. So I was kind of on the front end of what I have ended up doing at the Bradley Center, being on the back end with families who've already experienced that loss.
No, I think that's just an incredible help for those families. And I can't even imagine just the pain that these families go through, and being able to help them must have been very fulfilling, and even more than fulfilling. I don't even think fulfilling is like the best word, but
you know, incredibly rewarding, because honestly, it's been a healing process for me. When you can take something in your own life that's tragic and use it as a springboard to then find a way to help other people who are struggling, I don't think there's anything quite as fulfilling, at least in my mind, as being able to feel like that tragedy had some meaning, or there was a purpose, a bigger purpose behind what happened.
Yeah. So in starting this nonprofit and starting the Bradley Center, because this is a business podcast, we know that there may be students who want to start nonprofit organizations due to maybe experiences in their life or things that they want to help out, but aren't sure how to approach that, or may just be too afraid. Do you have any advice for those students who want to take that step but just don't know how to start that?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because from my perspective, faith is the foundation of my life, and it informs, you know, the decisions that I make. And I've told people many times that starting a nonprofit was like walking to the edge of a cliff and then taking a step off because you believe that God's going to be there to support you. It was not an easy decision to do what we did, because I don't have any business background. I didn't get an MBA. I didn't go to business school. But I dug in and did a lot of reading and a lot of interviewing, frankly, people who had started nonprofits, and looked specifically at a couple of grief support centers that were long established in the United States. Traveled to Portland, went to the Dougy Center. Some people who are familiar with the children's grief support community will recognize the Dougy Center. But they also offered training, and so we went through their training process. And it was, in many ways, a crash course in, you know, the business background behind how do you start a nonprofit. That was extremely helpful, but you can't just read the books. I mean, you've got to get down and do the really hard, deep and dirty work of figuring out where all the pieces are going to come from and how they're going to fit together. So my best advice would be talk to people who are doing what you want to do, and then make sure you've got God on board and that you feel like that's the direction that you need to go. I relied a lot on prayer and the notion that I was going to try to use that tragedy to make something good in the world. And frankly, I find that a lot of people in the nonprofit community have stories that involve some kind of a tragedy or a loss. That helps create empathy in those people, and they can see a need and they want to fill it. So I truly believe that some of the best work that is done on this earth is done by nonprofit organizations. And I would really encourage anybody who's passionate about what they're doing, and I think you have to have the passion to do it. But if you're passionate about it, jump in.
I love that. And I think a lot of students are going to love hearing that and hopefully feel just the drive to go forward and to do what you said, just to jump into it. And like you said as well, just to do the work. And even though it might be hard,
and you'll learn along the way. And, people who learn about your cause will want to help you. Anytime people, especially people who have power or funding available, that they're looking for a good cause, when they figure out that you're serious and that they feel like you are capable of doing what you're setting out to do, they will help you.
Yeah. I love that. Well, Carrie, the last question that we want to ask you on our podcast, since we are called Measuring Success Right, is we wanted to know, how do you personally measure success in your life?
Gosh, that's a really good question. I think my measure of success is the relationships I have with the people that I love and the people that I'm trying to serve. Certainly my students, my family, my friends, and if they can see in my life a measure of what I have gained through my faith and through the gospel of Jesus Christ, then I think that's a successful life.
Well, thank you so much for coming. We were so happy to have you here today with us.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Have a good rest of your week.
Make sure you subscribe to our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or SoundCloud so you never miss an episode. Be a friend and tell a friend about measuring success right.
This podcast is a project of the Marriott Student Review at Brigham Young University. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Marriott Student Review or online at marriottstudentreview.org.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect official policy or position of Brigham Young University or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.